Hey everybody, it's Pastor Keith. Hope everyone's doing well, staying safe. I wanted to touch base with the first video about our Philippians Bible study and tell you a little bit more about why I think this is going to be a great thing for us to study, especially in this time. So let me give you a little bit of background about the Philippians, the letter to the Philippians that's in our Bible. So who were the Philippians? The Philippians, or the city of Philippi, is a church that's in modern-day Greece. Paul, the Apostle Paul, visited along with a couple of other folks and founded that church in Philippi around the year 50 of the Common Era. And that area, the city of Philippi was actually the first city that Paul founded a church in Europe in. And so the people in Philippi were mainly Gentile. That means that before they became Christians, they weren't Jewish. And they had a very, very close relationship with Paul. They loved Paul. And Paul, he would go around and he would visit different sites and he would start different churches and stay with them for a little while before he moved on in his missionary journey so that he could start different churches. The church at Philippi really loved Paul and hoped that he would come and visit at some point in the near future. So the question about what was going on with Paul when he wrote this letter. And we can find out about this and about a lot of what we'll be talking about in today's study of Philippians from the letter itself. So we know, because he says it 3 times in the first chapter, that Paul was writing this letter from prison. We don't know which prison that he might have been in. It could have been in Rome, could have been in other cities called Ephesus or Caesarea, but we know that he was in prison. We know, based on some other parts of the Bible that talk about when Paul was in prison, that he probably wrote this letter between the years 55 and the early 60s in the Common Era. So probably between 5 and 10 or 12 years after he started the church in Philippi. So when we really dig into the letter, we see the reasons why Paul wanted to write a letter to the church in the first place. In the letter, we find out that the church at Philippi knew that Paul was in prison and they wanted to respond. In chapter 1, verse 19, we find out that the church at Philippi had been praying for Paul's release. And we also find out later in the letter in chapter 2 that they send one of their own people from Philippi. His name is Epaphroditus. They send him to Paul wherever he is imprisoned and give him gifts, ways that they can try to supply his needs. We find this out in chapter 2, verse 25. They also talk about it again in chapter 4, verse 18. But something happens to Epaphroditus when he goes to visit with Paul. He becomes very sick. It says in chapter 2, verses 26 to 27, he got so sick that he almost died. So Epaphroditus stays with Paul, or stays near Paul, while he's recovering. And then Paul writes about once Epaphroditus has recovered enough, he sends him back to his home, to Philippi. And all this is talked about in chapter 2, verses 25 through 29. So we know that the Philippians are praying for Paul. We know that they have sent gifts through their brother Epaphroditus. And so Paul is writing this letter in response for their concern and help, but that's not the only reason. We see he actually doesn't even talk about thanking them for their generosity and for their prayers until the very last chapter, chapter 4. And you see that in verses 10 through 20 of chapter 4, where he talks about how thankful and grateful he is for the concern that the Philippians had shown. And that includes what I have been calling a bumper sticker verse. Chapter 4, verse 13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And so we'll talk about what exactly Paul was saying when he said that phrase, and how us gaining a better idea of the context around that phrase helps us to know what Paul exactly meant. It wasn't like God is some genie in a bottle that's going to supply all of our needs. But we'll talk more about that as we get to chapter 4. But the real reason that Paul wanted to write to the church at Philippi, and the reason why I think it's important for us, especially right now in this time of social distancing and staying at home, that we study the book of Philippians. His main reason is that he wanted the church at Philippi to distinguish things that truly matter from things that do not really matter as much. So when we checked in last week on Friday and we read a little bit of the beginning of chapter 1, many of you pointed out how meaningful one verse in particular was, verse 10. I'm going to back up and start at verse 9 and just read this to you. And this is my prayer, that your love may overflow more and more with knowledge and full insight to help you determine what is best. So what Paul is talking about here is determining and distinguishing between what's important and what's not as important. That whistle you're hearing is the wind that's coming through my upstairs office. So in this letter, we will see what Paul thinks should matter more to the Philippians and what should matter less. And as we do that, we're going to be able to do some of the same things. I often say that when we're looking at some of these letters back in the last part of the New Testament in the Bible that we're reading other people's mail, I think that this is still incredibly valuable scripture, because now when we know what Paul was talking about in writing to this church at Philippi and we can gain a better understanding of it, then we can figure out what truths that Paul has in this letter really apply to us in our current context. When we, especially right now, are asking about those things that really, really matter, and maybe that we are figuring out matter even more in this current time than maybe we thought were not as important before. Maybe think about those relationships in your life that you can't be in physical contact with people right now. How much more are you placing value and emphasis in maintaining those relationships now? How much more important are those relationships to you now than they were, say, a month ago? So these are some of the things that we will be talking about as we go through the book of Philippians. So a little bit of an assignment for you. The word joy or rejoicing appears in this letter over and over and over again. And I want to actually, if you would like, to go through the 4 chapters of Philippians and actually count the amount of times that you see the word joy or rejoice or something that's similar to that, that Paul writes. Maybe jot those things down. And then ask yourself the question, if you were in prison, would you be talking to other people about joy? And I think that's really what Paul was trying to help the church at Philippi to realize. In the circumstances of life, sometimes things do not go as maybe you would have wanted, but you can still find joy when you realize that the things that are most important in your life, the things that really should matter the most, when you gain a greater appreciation for those things, that's where you can find your true joy, when you really put stock in the things that matter the most. Now, I'm not saying that Paul is only talking about joy in this letter. He also talks about worry, and he talks about things where he's disappointed in the church at Philippi. So I'm not saying that this is all pie in the sky. I'm not saying that in this time of social distancing and of COVID-19 that the only thing we should be feeling is joy, because we know that's not the truth. But I am saying that this letter will help us to better understand those things in our life that should bring us joy. And maybe we'll gain a greater gratitude and appreciation for those things through our study. So I really look forward to working with you guys and studying this short book with you. It's not really a book, it's a letter. It's only 4 chapters long. So feel free to go ahead and read. And I'll be getting more information out to you guys about when we will be meeting and what we'll be doing as we meet. If you want to help and be a leader in our youth check-ins, maybe helping to lead a game or helping with our Bible study of Philippians or helping in any way, reach out to me. Let me know. I would love to be able to give some of these things to you guys to lead and to help with, because I want this to be meaningful to you. I want this to be an experience you grow through. So I love you all. I miss you very much, and can't wait to check in with you again soon. In the meantime, stay healthy, stay safe, wash your hands, and we'll talk to you again soon.